Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to the EduSite Network. Our topic of discussion today is Determinants, Principles and Objectives of India's Foreign Policy, and for this very discussion and lecture we have with us in our studio Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, Aryabhat College, University of Delhi, and with this I welcome Sir. Thank you so much Sir for coming, and I request you to begin our today's lecture.
Thank you, Urvashi. In fact, today's discussion will be on India's foreign policy, specifically determinants, principles and objectives. In fact, this entire presentation discussion I will divide into three different parts. First of all, I would like to discuss that what do we mean by foreign policy of a nation state, and then secondly, what are the factors which shape and determine foreign policy of any state, the India or for that matter any other state, and how those determinants can be understood, how those determinants influence the formulation and the shaping of the foreign policy. In light of those determinants, one also has to take into account the principles which inform a foreign policy of a nation, because there are hardly any nation state in today's context whose foreign policy will be bereft of the principles. So, principles are very important. There can be some rugged states who do not believe in international morality, they do not believe in the principles of peace, order and democracy, but nonetheless majority of the states today in today's context believe in the principles. And therefore, in Indian context also it becomes very important, because India's foreign policy from the very beginning has been anchored on certain principles which are the principles accepted by the international community, the principles which are the cherished goals and the values of human beings. So, that way the principles play a very important role in India's foreign policy, but nonetheless one can say that the principles are there are certain principles which are negotiable, but most of the principles are non-negotiable. For example, the principles like belief in democracy, belief in peace, belief in global order, belief in a kind of friendly relations with different countries, principle of absorbing violence and war as tool and means of foreign policy. These are very important principles and they are non-negotiable, particularly from the point of view of India's foreign policy. So, this way the principles we have to take into account, and then in light of those principles how India has formulated its objectives. What are the objectives? What objectives it seeks to attain through its foreign policy, that is also very important. So, I mean these 3-4 issues I would like to take up in course of my discussion today. Now, to begin with, we should be very clear about one thing, that every nation state has two different set of policies. One is one policy which pertains to its own citizens, the policy which pertain to its domestic affairs matters, and they are basically put in category of domestic policies. But then there are policies which pertain to the states, other nation states, the policies which pertain to the neighbors, the the policies which pertain to the states who are not our neighbor, but nonetheless they are important entities in global politics. They are basically part of the committee of nations. So, this policy which pertains to not their own citizens, but pertains to others, they are normally put in the category of foreign policy. Now, foreign policy of any nation state, whether India or United States or for that matter Britain or any other country, foreign policy operates through number of means, but one most important tool of foreign policy, one can say that it is the vehicle on which the foreign policy moves, that is diplomacy. And diplomacy basically is the mechanism, the diplomacy is basically a kind of institution, is a kind of procedure through which the foreign policy operates, and normally the carrier of diplomacy are diplomats. They may be the bureaucracy, they may be the politically appointed people, they may be academicians having great understanding of the issues of foreign policy and world politics. So, diplomacy is an important vehicle of foreign policy. Now, in the course of this formulation of foreign policy, every nation state takes into account certain factors, and one of the most important factor which is basically factored in the formulation of foreign policy is national interest, that what are the national interests of a country. Now, one thing we should remember, that the national interest of country is determined by number of factors, and therefore, it is a dynamic concept. And secondly, we should also remember that nation state the national interest of a country may not tally with the national interest of other countries, and therefore, at times they become conflictual, and the job of the foreign policy with the help of diplomacy is to harmonize different national interests, the national interests of different countries, to create a harmony among them, so that they do not disturb the world peace without sacrificing one's basic interests. The nation states who seek to try, they should try to harmonize the national interests of one's own with the interests of the others. So, that is here, in fact, that is the point we should also be aware of, and therefore, the role of diplomacy is very important here, that it is diplomacy, the channel of diplomacy. It is basically the diplomats who ensure that how the national interest is promoted, how the national interest is protected. At the same time, within the broad framework of the principles and objectives of a foreign policy, those national interests are promoted and protected, but nonetheless they do not create a conflictual situation with the nation, the national interests of the other countries. So, this way, this is something very important. Now, this is a long debate in international politics, particularly in a sphere of foreign policy, that what determines most the foreign formulation of foreign policy, national interest or ideology. But these issues are part of the classical debate on foreign policy, that whether it is national interest which should be considered the most important determining factor of foreign policy, or is it ideology. Now, this debate has been going on for a long period of time, and this is inconclusive. But nonetheless, the people, the scholars who have basically expressed their opinion, their ideas on this issue, they more or less agree that national interest is a very important factor for the formulation of, or for example, the working and operation of the foreign policy of a nation state. Now, in context of the 1960s, differences which cropped up between erstwhile Soviet Union and China, both countries believed in the same ideology, the ideology of socialism, communism, influenced by the ideas of Marx and Engels and Lenin. Nonetheless, these two countries had a lot of differences on issues, and therefore, that split, it is commonly referred to as Sino-Soviet conflict or rift or differences in 60s, that came as a great jolt to the school of thought which believed that ideology cannot be ignored in discussion on foreign policy, and ideology plays very important role. Ideas have important role to play, and there is some element of truth into it also, because ideology has important role, because ideology gives a direction, ideology gives a kind of a principled framework to the foreign policy. But this Sino-Soviet split or the differences of 60s established one fact, that the two countries, two important countries, they believed in the same ideology, but nonetheless they could not resolve their differences, and the differences were mostly on account of the national interest of the two countries, because Chinese national interest and the Soviet national interest of that period of time basically influenced their policies, and that led to those differences. So, therefore, this school of thought which always believed that national interest is very important, in fact, it had a very triumphant moment when they proved with the help of this development that how national interests can be considered more important than ideology. Now, there have been great statesmen who have always given more importance to ideology without of course sacrificing national interests. There have been great idealists. There have been statesmen like Wilson, there have been statesmen like Nehru. They always privileged ideas, ideologies, particularly ideologies like democracy, peace, fraternity and all these values, but nonetheless they also try to harmonize it with national interests. At times some of them have been criticized, particularly Nehru is criticized for giving more importance to ideology than national interests, and therefore 1962 Chinese aggression, people often refer that Nehru couldn't basically protect India's national interests, while at the same time he was trying to champion the cause of ideology, that ideology of peace, non-violence and non-alignment and so on and so forth. So, one thing is very clear that national interest is very important for foreign policy. Now, national interest is sum total of the interest of a country at a particular point of time. Now, national interests are two different types. One type of national interest keeps changing, but there is another set of interests which are national interests which never change. For example, India's integrity, territorial integrity, unity, democracy, these are the interests which are national interests, and they are they never change, they are non-negotiable. But then there are interests which keep changing. For example, there was a time when India's national interest basically implied that India shouldn't have any diplomatic relationship with Israel, but later on we discovered that the same national interest, India's national interest also informed the new policy, which decided to have a diplomatic relationship with Israel and rather having a friendly terms with Israel. So, I mean the context was different, that when it decided to have not having any truck with Israel, diplomatic association with Israel, the context was specific. At that particular moment, the India's national interest, it suited India's national interest that it shouldn't have any diplomatic relationship. But later on, when it decided otherwise, when it decided to have a full diplomatic relationship, India's national interest at that particular moment basically was informing its decision. So, therefore, what I am trying to basically put before the listeners, that national interest therefore has to be divided into two different categories. One category which can change, but the other category which never changes, irrespective of the change in government, irrespective of the change in other factors, those interests are non-changeable, are non-negotiable. And I have put specifically interests like unity, integrity, democracy and so on and so forth. So, this way this national interest has to be understood. Now, when we discuss the determinants of foreign policy, and here we are discussing determinants of India's foreign policy, we should be very clear about one thing, that national interest is important and India is no exception to this rule, that how a foreign policy can protect India's national interests. And national interests, of course, as I have discussed, of two types, and one of them can change, other cannot change. But apart from national interest, there are other factors which are also very influential, they are also very important when it comes to the question of formulation or framing of foreign policy. And those factors, they are called determinants of foreign policy, and those determinants are normally two types. One is the historical determinants, and there is other determinant which is called domestic determinants. And the historical is something which is basically handed down by history, and one does not have much choice in it. For example, in Indian context, the historical factors, one can say that what has determined India's foreign policy is the historical tradition of peace and non-violence, the two important principles. They have been largely determined by our historical tradition, our culture, our philosophy, our way of life, and therefore India has had great philosophers, thinkers who basically articulated this principle very forcefully. Even in modern times, in 20th century, Gandhi championed this cause of non-violence in a big way and has become a source of inspiration for many countries in today's world. So, for India also this historical factor is very important. Now, within history we have basically we have to take into account, for example, that how different traditions, social, political, cultural traditions, they pass on from generation to generation, and how a country, when it basically formulates or frames its foreign policy, also takes into account that what is the social cultural milieu of that particular country. In Indian context, for example, there are 2-3 issues which we should remember are basically not a new construct, but rather they are part of our long historical evolution. They are part of our cultural heritage. For example, the question of tolerance, which in modern parlance it is translated into secularism, that freedom and equality and dignity to all creeds and all sects, all faiths. This type of principle is part of India's plural cultural tradition, and therefore this has been important factor in shaping India's foreign policy, because India always tries to create a world order. India always supports any endeavor, any initiative which tries to create a more plural, harmonious and multicultural world order, where different cultures can flourish, where different schools of thought can have the freedom of expression, where different sects, different creeds have full freedom of action, and of course with the condition that they do not disturb peace, they do not disturb social order, they do not lead to any violent situation. So, this way this is part of the Indian tradition, the tolerance. The next factor which also should be considered as a part of India's history, part of India's tradition, and part of our rich heritage, cultural heritage, and that is the relationship between means and end. Because there are many countries, there have been examples in history where countries try to frame their foreign policy in such a manner that end was privileged over means, that whatever means are adopted for attaining end is immaterial. If a country succeeds in attaining those ends, then perhaps that is perhaps the only yardstick to judge the success and success of foreign policy. But India from the very beginning has given due primacy to both means and end. In fact, there has to be a relationship between means and end. End is important for foreign policy, but that does mean that means should simply be thrown into the dustbin. It has to be harmonized with the means, proper means, and in context of foreign policy the means become very clear. The means have to be democratic means have to be peaceful means have to be more judiciously calculated, which is in the interest of human beings. So, I mean this way means and relationship has always been privileged, and here one can say that this factor in India's foreign policy, which has determined the formulation and framing of foreign policy, is basically a historical factor, a historical legacy, and it has determined. Similarly, this question of non-violence. Non-violence is a very important tool, very important principle of India's foreign policy. Now, even non-violence has emerged out of our historical evolution, out of our historical our history. For example, the great maker or champion of non-violence, of course, in 20th century is Gandhi, but even Gandhi tried to borrow this question of tried to basically appropriate or try to take this entire principle of non-violence from Indian philosophical tradition, from Jainism, from Buddhism, from Hinduism, different traditions which existed in India, and therefore he tried to put it in a new framework, political framework, and that has become so important in today's context. So, this way these issues can be considered part of India's historical tradition, historical legacy, and these things have been determining India's foreign policy in a big way. Now, apart from historical factors, there are also some domestic factors, and the domestic factors is a basically combination of number of factors which determine foreign policy. And in Indian context, one can say that these factors are geography, one can say that these factors are the geographical location of a country. Now, then you have the kind of economic structure, economic situation you have, that also determines the framing of foreign policy. The political structure determines formulation of foreign policy, social structure determines formulation of foreign policy, leadership plays important role. So is the case with public opinion. Similarly, you have the international situation, the international environment, that also plays important role in the framing of foreign policy, and these are the determinants that any foreign policy, when it is framed or when it is working, when it operates, basically these factors basically are taken into account, that how the foreign policy is going to be a kind of vehicle for promoting the sum total of the interests of a country, the national interests, and those interests have the components or the basically those national the national interest has the elements from all of them. So, this way one can say that there are number of domestic factor which one should take into account while discussing the determinants for. Let us start with geography. Geographically India's location is also very significant in framing of India's foreign policy. In fact, the other day when I was speaking on India's neighborhood diplomacy, I also mentioned that how geographically India is located in a situation where you have mountains, you have sea, long coastline, you have a situation that where the Indian Ocean is not far off, which has always been a zone of conflict, and therefore India's foreign policy is greatly influenced by the geographical location. Then India's historical experience tells India that whenever there has been a foreign presence of a foreign power in this region of the world, that is South Asia, India's security, India's safety have been compromised. Therefore, India always believes that geographically India should be more protected. At the same time, politically it also wants that this part of the world should be free from external interference or the power play of the big powers. So, this way geography plays important role, and within geography, of course, it is not only geostrategic factor, that is the security, but geography also implies that what type of resources are basically available to a country on basis of which it can basically calibrates its foreign policy. For example, geography under geography you should also discuss that what type of natural resources a country is endowed with. For example, if you are rich in mineral resources, if you have the energy security in terms of oil reserve, if you have the possibility of having energy through gas, if you have a if you are surplus in terms of many other valuable minerals which are very important in today's context for the development of economy, if you are self-reliant, self-sufficient, then that will give additional confidence to the makers and the framers of foreign policy, because then it provides them a leeway, a kind of leverage on basis of which they can have a more confident and more autonomous foreign policy. Otherwise, what happens that if you are constrained on these factors, if you are dependent on other countries for your energy, for example, if you are importing oil from different countries to basically support your economy, if you are dependent on other countries for food grains, there was a situation in India when India was not self-reliant in food grains in 50s and 60s before Green Revolution, and that compromised India's autonomy in terms of the formulation or working of India's foreign policy. For example, PL 480 episode vis-a-vis United States of America is the best reminder of this fact, and how lack of self-sufficiency in food grains vastly influenced India's foreign policy in those periods, where India couldn't make autonomous decisions in certain matters because it was constrained, and whenever it made autonomous decisions, which India tried to do as a very honorable and dignified member of the Committee of Nations, but then those countries on which India was dependent tried to blackmail India that will stop the supply of these things. So therefore, the availability of these resources, which one should consider the part of this geographical factor, are very important. For example, India's self-sufficiency in food grains, India's self-sufficiency in many other factors today in science and technology. For example, science and technology is also influenced, the growth of science and technology is also influenced apart from ideas on certain material factors, and how India has suffered on that account is a different story. During non-alignment, when India gave a clear-cut slogan of development against development and disarmament against arms race, and therefore, what happened that India was deprived of the know-how, the scientific know-how, and India had to rely on its own capability, including the nuclear capability which India developed with its own resources, both level of thinking, level of ideas, as well as the material resources. So therefore, the self-sufficiency is a very important factor, and here the geography plays very important, and India in that sense can be considered quite fortunate to have abundance of mineral resources. India is such a vast country, India has such a diversity, there are different regions which are basically mineral rich regions. India has a great amount of flora and fauna, India has number of factors which can be considered to be of great asset so far as the geographical factor as determinant of foreign policy is concerned. Now, the economic development, what type of economy you have, that also makes lot of difference in the framing of foreign policy. If you are a developing economy, if you are trying to fight against, you are trying to fight the poverty of the people, if you are trying to augment your resources, if you are trying to make use of your meager resources in such a way that a kind of just social order is created, then of course the foreign policy has to be in tune with that mission. And India, in Indian context, this applies rather more forcefully, because when India decided to go for non-alignment, the idea of non-alignment was basically influenced by this factor, that India at that time did not want to join any of the camps which were locked into this fierce ideological battle called Cold War, because India thought that if India joined any of these camps, then it will become a camp follower, and it will be it would be deprived of the support and help which it might require from other camp. And this kind of policy suited India's national interest, the economic interest, where India expected help from all countries of the world, those who were developed, those who had more scientific know-how, they had more scientific resources, because India's main mission was to develop its economy and to support its people. So therefore, economic development is economic structure is a very important factor as a determinant of foreign policy. Now, we have seen that how after independence the trajectory of India's economic development has been taking different forms and different shapes. Since 90s we have moved in different direction, as it is called new economic policy, under which we have liberalized, we have downsized the state presence in the economy, we have opened up our market, we have opened up our economy, and then accordingly we have seen that our foreign policy has also been changing. Now, the kind of engagement, kind of exchange India has with different powers of the world, the economic diplomacy, one can say, is basically reminiscent of this fact, that how India's growth, India's developmental history, how India's achievements in terms of its economic progress have contributed to India's foreign policy. The confidence within India is basically trying to work out its foreign policy in the global context. Now, we have seen that even now, when India takes number of positions and stands in international fora, including WTO, World Trade Organization. Recently, we have seen how India has taken a very firm stand on issue of food security, that in spite of tremendous pressure from different powers, the big powers of the world, that India should be party to this treaty, this agreement. India defied and India rather resisted that pressure. Under this on this basis, that India's priority is to feed its own people, to provide them food security, and being part of that treaty would amount to compromising on that, and therefore, India was not ready to sacrifice the interests of the country, the national interest, that is food security. So, therefore, economic situation of a country is a very important factor as a determinant of in foreign policy, and we have seen these changes, that 50s and 60s we have a different type of economy and economic situation. In 70s we had some changes, and with the 90s, as we have seen, that the new economic policy has led to number of initiatives and changes, and accordingly India has also in fact changed the priorities. India has also changed the direction in which the foreign policy is moving, of course within the broad framework of India's national interest, and the national interest of course is also determined in a big way with the economic situation in the country. So, economic structure is another determinant factor along with the geography. The third important factor is the political system. The political system of a country also influences the framing of foreign policy in a big way. For example, in Indian context, India's political system, which is a democratic political system, it is a parliamentary representative democracy. We have a vibrant and active democratic system, and therefore, it influences India's foreign policy in a big way. For example, India has consistently taken a stand that whenever a country or the people fight for democratic rights, India would extend full sympathy and cooperation to such people in such country. And there are instances where India, even even after having some losses in terms of friendship and other things, has taken a firm stand on question of democracy. So, political system, if a country does not have a political system based on democratic principle, then that influences its foreign policy in a big way. For example, you can see in our neighborhood Pakistan, which has which started roughly around the same time when India started its democratic journey, but we have seen many ups and downs, on many occasions we have seen in that how the military takeover has taken place, and therefore, this inconsistent democratic tradition in Pakistan has influenced their foreign policy, as a continuous uninterrupted vibrant democracy has been influencing our foreign policy. The political system plays important role. Similarly, you have the social system. Social system, what type of social structure you have in the country, that also influences the framing of foreign policy. If a society is more homogeneous, if you do not have diversity, plurality, then of course, it will be reflected in your principles, and it will be reflected in the orientation of the foreign policy. For example, in Indian context, India is a multicultural plural society, where you have different religions, different languages, different traditions coexist since centuries, and therefore, the kind of tolerance and the kind of harmonious culture which have been created here, they are important reference point for India's foreign policy. Therefore, India's foreign policy always tries to chart out a course which is based on secularism, which is based on tolerance, which is based on peace, which is based on harmony. Unlike many other countries where the social structure is more homogeneous, they do not bother of the minorities, they do not bother for the groups which are not quite preponderant in number, and therefore, they basically formulate and they work out their foreign policy in such a way, they handle their foreign policy in such a way that the interests of the majority, the interest of the homogeneous society are reflected there. But in Indian context, we have seen that how India has from the very beginning has tried to basically preserve the cultural heritage, the cultural milieu of the society, the social structure which is quite plural and multicultural, and therefore India's foreign policy also tries to articulate the same principle through its engagement with the Committee of Nations. Now, this determinant, the social structure, is also should be seen in context of these two other factors we have discussed, geography and economy. Now, other factor which is also important is basically the public opinion, which also determines the foreign policy of country in a big way. Particularly this factor is important in a situation of democratic government, because ultimately the democratic government has to take into account the opinion of the people, because after all they are the representing their interests, they are the representatives of the people. So, therefore, public opinion plays very important role, and it determines the foreign policy of a country. And therefore, what happens that whenever a party in government takes a major decision on foreign policy issues, it also factors in that how this is going to how the people are going to react to that particular policy. For example, we have seen that on civil nuclear deal with United States of America in 2007-8, what happened that the political parties were divided, but nonetheless in the next election, in fact, it became a part of the political manifesto of different political parties, and the opinion of the people was sought, because it was parliament which was endorsing it, and the members of the parliament are there as a representative of the people. But on this particular issue, how the people looked at it was not clear. But the next election, when it came and it became part of the political manifesto of different political parties, that was put before the people, and people basically when they express their mind through their ballot during the elections, they returned the same party to power which had basically pushed for this deal. So, therefore, one can say that it was endorsed. So, in this way we can see that public opinion is a very important factor as a determinant of foreign policy. In modern times, this public opinion cannot be ignored. In fact, we have seen that there are many examples from United States of America that the government of the day decided for a particular policy, but when it reached the two houses of parliament, particularly Senate, rejected it. It was with recently it happened to the CTBT. So, this way earlier it had happened to Wilson's Wilson's famous 14 points and this entire Paris Peace settlement. So, this way we can see that public opinion is a very important determinant of foreign policy, particularly in context of a democratic system, and it applies to India, because India is a vibrant, active, working democracy. Therefore, public opinion has always been playing very important role in formulation of the foreign policy. Now, coming to the other issues apart from this public opinion, there is a leadership factor. The leadership also is a very important factor in the framing and formulation of foreign policy. Now, in Indian context, we have seen that we have had number of leaders who gave direction to the foreign policy of the country. The most important name here, of course, is Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, because one can find the imprint of Nehru on India's foreign policy in a big way. There have been changes in government, there have been changes in political equations and political power, but nonetheless, the certain principles which were formulated at the time of the inception of India's foreign policy, they are continuing even today. Even the political parties have come and they have gone, but they have continued some of the principles which were formulated at around that point of time. Now, Nehru's speech in September 1946 on All India Radio at that time, when India was basically moving in direction of in 47, September 1947, when India had attained independence. I mean, that speech is always considered to be very important for understanding India's foreign policy, and you can see that in that speech he laid out the broad principles, the contours of India's foreign policy, and since then we have been basically working with the help of those principles. I will come to those principles later, but what I would like to share with my listeners that the leadership factor is very important. It is not only in case of India, even in some advanced countries like United States of America, there have been many eminent statesmen who have given who have left their imprint on their foreign policy. One can just mention the name of Monroe, one can mention the name of Wilson, one can mention the name of Truman, Roosevelt, and so on and so forth. So, I mean they have been known for formulating and promulgating different doctrines, and they have given a direction and shape to United States of America's foreign policy. So is the case of India. Now, apart from Nehru, there are other prime ministers, there have been other prime ministers whose contributions cannot be ignored. They have always played very important role. For example, Mrs. Indira Gandhi played very important role, particularly in late 60s and 70s, particularly during her time India fought a war against Pakistan, and to its success, in fact India basically came victorious. Similarly, she also went for the first nuclear test in 74. Then non-aligned movement, she gave a particular turn to this entire orientation of non-aligned policy of India. For example, the kind of radicalization which took place within non-aligned movement was basically done during her time. So, Mrs. Indira Gandhi also can be considered providing a very important leadership factor to India's foreign policy. Even subsequently, you have had many prime ministers. Rajiv Gandhi, of course, on international global disarmament issues, he played important role. Even in context of the neighborhood diplomacy, his initiative vis-a-vis Sri Lanka was quite significant. But most importantly, in 90s, when India started its new economic policies, the prime minister during whose time this policy was initiated was Narasimha Rao, and his contribution to some extent is as significant as India's first prime minister Nehru, which is basically not appreciated at times, because not only he tried to, within the broad principles which were laid down during the formative phase, he continued to work within both those principles, but within those principles he completely gave a new orientation in accordance with the new situation which was prevailing in the world politics. And the most important factor at that time was end of the Cold War and disappearance of one superpower, Soviet Union, which with India had a very friendly relationship. And therefore, this disappearance of Soviet Union as a dependable ally created a kind of void, a kind of crisis within the India's foreign policy establishment, and therefore, the new orientation which was provided during Narasimha Rao's time was quite significant. For example, the policy of look-east policy, where India tried to basically stretch the hands of friendship to Southeast Asian neighbors, the ASEAN countries. Similarly, the kind of the friendly gestures India made towards the Western blocs, power blocs, particularly United States of America and European Union. Similarly, India tried to reorganize its relationship with its neighbors. India kind of tried to reframe its new relationship with the successor state of Soviet Union, that was Russia. All these initiatives happened during his time, along with the kind of impetus which he provided to India's economic development and economic strategy. The neighborhood diplomacy, of course, also he tried to basically reorient, but the credit goes to the later prime minister, particularly Gujral, as he formulated that Gujral doctrine vis-a-vis neighborhood countries. Similarly, later we have had the prime minister like Vajpayee, who took many important initiatives in foreign policy matters within the broad principles which were laid down earlier. Subsequently, even UPA 1 and 2, we have seen that number of initiatives were taken. Even recently, we have seen that the new Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been taking number of initiatives so far as the neighborhood diplomacy is concerned, as well as the relationship with China, United States of America is concerned. So, what we find that leadership always plays very important role. Within the broad principles which are there, leadership initiative always makes a difference. If you have a more visionary, you have a more energetic leader, then of course, the foreign policy of a country will basically move faster. It will basically be able to deliver more effectively than if the leader, if a country has a leader which is lacking initiative and vision. So, therefore, India, one can say that is basically fortunate to have had number of leaders who took number of important initiatives in basically this foreign policy formulation. Now, apart from leadership, there is also a factor of the military preparedness, what type of military preparedness a country has, that can give some confidence to the foreign policy makers and the workers, because then they can basically chart out a course for themselves in a more definitive way. For example, lack of military preparedness weakens the confidence of the leaders and basically foreign policy establishment. For example, we have seen that post 62 till the time India moved in direction of streamlining and basically putting in order its military preparedness, that there was a period when India was suffering from a kind of diffidence, because military preparedness, lack of military preparedness, perhaps people consider one of the factors for India's debacle in 1962. So, this military preparedness is also important. So, somehow we can say that these are the broad determinants through which the foreign policy is basically influenced. These determinants help shaping, formulating, reshaping and orienting the foreign policy of a country. Now, apart from determinants, there are also certain principles and objectives of a foreign policy. Now, in Indian context, there are number of principles and objectives, and sometimes those principles appear to be like objective, because the dividing line is quite thin, overlapping, but nonetheless the principles are the principles which are the guiding principles. They act as a framework within which the foreign policy works, and objectives are basically the goals which a country sets before itself and tries to obtain those goals within the given framework of principles. As I mentioned earlier, there are countries who do not believe in principles. Of course, there are very few countries today, but nonetheless they are considered as rugged states who do not bother for international morality, they do not bother for humanity, they do not bother for peace and order. They simply try to attain their objectives by hook or by crook, and therefore such countries are isolated. But there are countries like India which believe that the principles, any objective, any goal, attainment of any objective and goal should be basically tied with the principles of a country, principles of foreign policy. Only within the broad principles, if a country attains a particular objective, it should be commended, or it should be it should be considered a success. Otherwise, if you are sacrificing certain principles for attaining few objectives, however important that those objectives may be, but still it does not deserve any appreciation, because principles are perhaps the guiding light for any foreign policy. In Indian context, those principles are the principle of non-violence, the principle of peace, then you have the principle of non-alignment as very important principle. Similarly, India also has the principle like Panchashil, the 5 principles of coexistence, which India formulated, India and China formulated vis-a-vis the relationship between the two countries in 50s. But nonetheless, the Panchashil India tried to extend to the global fora, that these are the principles through which the countries of the world should try to operate their foreign policy. That how peaceful coexistence, non-interference in each other matters, how to, honoring and respecting the territorial unity and integrity of other countries. These are the important principles on basis of which a country should try to work out its foreign policy. So, Panchashil, of course, it was in context of India-China relationship, but nonetheless it has a larger range of applications so far as India's foreign policy is concerned. Similarly, anti-colonialism. India has always, India itself was a victim of colonial rule, and therefore India has always extended support to anti-colonial fight in the world. Even till recently, when South Africa had not attained independence, it was fighting against apartheid. India extended full help, and through non-alignment and outside, India always expresses voice against this type of racism and colonialism. So, India even today sticks to this principle of anti-colonialism in the world, that there should not be any initiative, any attempt, any effort by the big powers to colonize the weaker ones. Now, this colonialism, whether it is a colonialism of old type or colonialism of new type, that is neo-colonialism. In fact, India always expresses its voice against it. Similarly, India's faith in United Nations as a global body for peace and order. India gives unconditional support to all initiative of United Nations. Rather, India always feels that all initiatives, international initiatives, have to be rooted through United Nations, because that is the only body which represents the will of all the people of the world, that represents the will of all the countries of the world. So, United Nations. Similarly, India's belief in dialogue and negotiation as means of foreign policy, not war. India, of course, has not completely absorbed war, but nonetheless it does not believe war as a tool of foreign policy, as many other countries even today believe that war is an important tool. It is a tool, but it is only the last resort to protect national interests. Therefore, the first priority, the primacy India gives is to negotiation and dialogue, not war. So, these are some of the principles which one can consider to be guiding India's foreign policy from the very beginning, and India is sticking to those principles even today. Similarly, the objectives, as I mentioned, that sometimes the principles and objectives, the dividing line is quite thin and they become overlapping, but nonetheless there are certain objectives which India tries to attain with the help of these broad principles. One is basically anti-racism, anti-colonialism. India also tries to attain economic development, and India also tries to attain a kind of dignified place in the world order. Similarly, India's objective is also to basically create a peaceful world situation, where basically the resources are diverted for development, not for armaments. Therefore, India has always worked for disarmament. This is one of the important objectives. Even during the heyday of non-aligned movement, even later, India has tried to promote disarmament. Though India has opted for nuclear weapons, but India also takes a very consistent stand that if nuclear weapons are declared illegitimate weapons in the world, India will be the first country to go for this. But till the time any country preserves its right to retain nuclear weapons, India will also exercise this option of having nuclear weapons. But nonetheless, India's stand on disarmament is quite consistent, and India tries to put disarmament and development at the center of global negotiations. So, this is one objective which is part of India's objective of having a very self-reliant and self-sufficient economy. India also tries to create a peaceful, plural, multicultural, harmonious world order, and for that India tries to have a very vibrant and active United Nations body. So, these are some of the objectives which India has been following since the days of non-alignment, and even today it sticks to some of these principles, and within those principles it tries to attain its objectives. So, this is how we have to look at that, how the determinants, what are the determinants which have shaped India's foreign policy, how India has formulated its principles, and how it has laid down certain objectives for itself which it tries to attain within those principles. I will stop.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, for giving us a wonderful insight into India's foreign policy along with the various determinants, principles and the objectives of it. So, friends, with this we come to the close of our lecture, and we must thank sir for being here and sparing his valuable time. We really appreciate it, sir. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
And friends, keep watching, because we have planned more lectures with sir, and they would be uploaded on YouTube as they are webcasted live as well. So, friends, with this we take your leave. Thank you and have a wonderful day ahead.